Hello everyone, Mr. Evans here with your pre-recorded live lesson for Unit 1, Lesson 4 on the storage of carbon. As we spoke about in the previous lesson, where the carbon exists in the world matters to its effect on our environment. Carbon is the basic atom that is involved in all biomolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, amino acids. They all have carbon. Carbon's everywhere. But the form that it's in and where it is matters in terms of the stability of the environment because it's reactive. It has a lot of different effects on different things. So we are going to talk about where that carbon is stored naturally and some of the places where it's being stored unnaturally. So as carbon moves through the biosphere, as it moves through life on Earth, as it moves through the ground, as it moves through the atmosphere, it is going through the carbon cycle. We've all probably heard about the water cycle from elementary school, where the water evaporates up into the air and then it moves over onto the land and it rains and it goes in the river and then it goes back to the ocean and the cycle repeats. That's a water cycle. It's pretty easy to understand. The carbon cycle is similar even though it has more steps and it's more complicated, but it is still a cycle that moves through nature, as you can see by these arrows. So the carbon moves through the atmosphere, it gets sucked up by plants in photosynthesis. Plant uses it to build itself, to grow the tree, to grow the plant. Plant dies, the carbon goes back into the ground. Sometimes at that point it's eaten by an animal or it's decomposed by a bacteria, but sometimes it actually gets pushed deep, deep underground where it becomes a fossil fuel of some kind, like coal or oil or natural gas. And then at some point, that carbon is going to make its way back up to the surface. Now, for for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to talk about the two ways it goes from being underground to being back above ground. And this is in the case where it gets buried deep, deep underground in a natural fossil fuel deposit. So, naturally, the only way that that carbon can make its way back above the ground is through a volcanic eruption or a natural geological formation. Sometimes it can be released in geothermal vents. The big one is volcanoes. So a volcano erupts and spews a bunch of carbon back out into the atmosphere. Sometimes it can actually kind of bubble its way back up to the top. That takes a long time. But the bottom line is these natural cycles that put this carbon back into the atmosphere when it's deep below ground are very slow, rare, and balanced. But recently, within the last 100 years, humans have been digging deep, 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 deep down into the ground and pulling this carbon source out at a rate much higher than nature can balance it back out. Nature cannot absorb the carbon we are putting out fast enough. So it is basically getting stuck here in the atmosphere. It's getting pulled out by oil rigs and coal mining operations and whatnot. It's getting burned in power plants and automobiles and all the modern stuff that we use, and it's just getting sent back into the atmosphere. And there are not enough plants on the surface of the earth right now uh, for a multitude of reasons. They cannot reabsorb it fast enough. So it's just staying up here in the atmosphere. So the places where the carbon is stored is called a carbon sink. Think about when you turn on the faucet, where do you store the water? You store it in the sink until you use it. So fossil fuel deposits are carbon sinks. Plants are carbon sinks because it's a place where the carbon is being stored for a certain amount of time. There are short-term sinks like plants because the plant isn't going to live forever. Even like big trees don't live forever, even though some do live for a very long time. Those are short-term sinks. And down here underground, when it's deposited as fossil fuels, coal, oil, or whatever, that's a long-term sink. We are digging up these long-term sinks and putting them into the atmosphere faster than nature can reabsorb them. Another word for it is a reservoir, carbon reservoir. So the four main reservoirs or sinks on the planet are the atmosphere, the oceans, the ground itself, and the biosphere. The atmosphere, CO2 gas. Sometimes there's amounts of methane too, which also contains carbon. Carbon dioxide, methane, and a few other trace gases in the atmosphere hold this carbon. The big carbon sink is the ocean. The ocean holds the most carbon. All of the plankton, the algae, all the microscopic organisms in the ocean, all the fish, all the whales, all the mollusks, and everything. All that life in the ocean is a carbon sink. The ocean itself, the water in the ocean, can also dissolve and hold carbon dioxide gas. The gas can actually dissolve and sit in the water itself, and it sits there. So since there's so much water on Earth, that is the main carbon reservoir on Earth. When the marine life dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean and it sits there and it decomposes. So there's these big carbon sinks at the bottom of the sea as well, holding all this carbon. So that's the biggest one. Sediments, certain rocks like limestone, and geez, what's the other big one? Coal, that's a rock. those hold carbon as well. Charcoal, anthracite, things like that. Those hold carbon, so carbon can be stored in rocks. And then the terrestrial biosphere, which is the plants, the animals, all of the life. Those are holding carbon as well. Now, this is kind of a rough breakdown of how much each reservoir holds. This is an estimate in gigatons of carbon. So as you can see, there's a lot in the rocks. You can see there's a lot in the rocks here, and I wanted to kind of point this out here really quick. According to this, it looks like this chart says that the rocks store a whole lot more carbon than the ocean, even though it says differently up here in the lesson. So I wanted to clarify that. I'm pretty sure that with this number, it's talking about the entirety of the Earth, even like deep, deep under the ground, because, you know, Earth is a big ball of rock with a bunch of stuff on top of it, the water, the atmosphere, the plants, the animals, but it is still just a big ball of rock if you strip away all that other stuff. So I think this number right here is referring to that. And the vast majority of this is never going to come in contact with the atmosphere or the biosphere or anything. It's just not a factor. So I think that's what it's talking about here, just to eliminate some confusion if you have any. So that's why this number is so big, because it is referring to like the whole planet from the surface all the way down to the core. And most of that carbon is going to be where it is like forever, because it's so deep below the surface, like way down into the mantle and the magma and the core, and it's just not coming out like ever. So that's why this number is so big. I think up here in this earlier part, when it was talking about the ocean, it's referring to carbon that can move through the carbon cycle. Most of this is not going to move through the carbon cycle, just because it's buried so deeply in the Earth. So that's why this number is so big. But you can see here that the next biggest number is the ocean. This is the carbon that can move through the carbon cycle. All of the carbon in the ocean can move through the cycle. Now I notice here that total biosphere, there's not that much compared to the ocean. So there is some carbon stored in the life on Earth in what's called the biomass. Like if you took the mass of all the living things, all the plants, all the insects, all the animals, and you like weighed it and you weighed just the carbon that was in there, you would get a number close to this. These are just estimates, remember. Fossil fuels, this is how much is stored. So you can kind of see the levels of difference here. Now what's happening here is we are taking, as we drill oil and gas and coal and pull that up, we are moving it from here to here. And as you can see, the atmosphere doesn't really hold that much carbon naturally. but we're kind of accelerating that process by drilling it out, burning it, and we're moving it to here. And it is not able to move into here from the atmosphere fast enough. So it's just building up here in the atmosphere. So skipping down the slide a little bit, let's talk about the carbon that's stored in rocks and sediments. When carbon is stored in rocks and in soil sediments and things like that, it usually has a long residence time. Rocks last a long time. Now, the carbon can still, kind of evaporate out of the rocks. Maybe the rock gets broken down by a river and the carbon gets dissolved into the water, but that takes a long time. So this is an average of the residence time of carbon. So for plant biomass, this is an average, and it's a pretty wide-ranging average. The average time in a plant that the carbon will spend is 9 years. That's like the average lifespan of every plant on Earth, which is a pretty kind of ridiculous average to make, because some plants live 6 months and some live for 3,000 years. So it's kind of a wide-ranging average, but it's still an average. Bottom line is, on average, carbon doesn't spend a whole lot of time stuck in the plants. The atmosphere, it's variable. It's very variable. It's dependent upon the season. It's dependent upon the local temperature. It's dependent upon the local rainfall. It's just really hard to even set that to a number. Oceans, 422 years. Oceans kind of hold it for a lot, because like if the carbon is way below the surface of the ocean, it's going to take some time for it to churn up. Fossil deposits, 10 million years. That's an average. If that carbon gets buried deep underground, it's going to be there for a long time. And deep ocean sediments, this is like at the very bottom of the sea, deep down, miles down below the surface of the ocean, 3,000 years. So you can see that this is where most of the cycling happens, through the plant biomass and also through the atmosphere. Those are the main sources of the carbon moving through the carbon cycle. So that's going to be it for today. I'm sorry I skipped around a little bit because I wanted to kind of bounce around this lesson to clarify some things. Bottom line is, what you need to know is how carbon moves through planet Earth, moves through plants, moves through the atmosphere, moves through rocks, moves through the ocean. And this is all about how that carbon is taken in. It's not like, that one carbon atom is just walking through all these different places. It goes through a process. Carbon dioxide's in the air. A plant takes the carbon dioxide in, does photosynthesis, makes glucose with the carbon. Now that carbon's in the glucose. A gazelle comes along and eats the leaf off of the tree that just photosynthesized that carbon, and it's eating the leaves. So now that glucose is in the gazelle. Okay? Then the gazelle breaks it down and makes ATP out of it, or makes a muscle cell, or makes a bone cell. It does something with that carbon that it ate. Then a lion comes along and eats the gazelle. Now that carbon's in the lion, and the lion makes muscles or bone or whatever with it. That same carbon. Okay, then the lion dies, and then the lion's body begins to decompose, and the bacteria decompose the lion's body, and now that carbon is in the bacteria. Then that bacteria dies and it's sitting on the ground, and then a landslide happens, and that dead bacteria's little bacteria corpse gets buried under the ground. It gets pushed deep underground over many millions of years. Now that same carbon is deep underground, and it gets cooked and baked, and it gets turned into oil by all the pressure and the heat from deep underground. And then, a drill comes down through the top after millions and millions of years of the bacteria carbon sitting there underground being turned into oil, and an oil drill comes down and it sucks that oil up out of the ground, and then it gets sent to a power plant where it gets refined into gasoline, and now that carbon's in the gasoline in the gas pump, and then you come along and you pump the gasoline into your car, and your car burns that carbon out of the gasoline, and it comes out your exhaust pipe, and now it's back in the atmosphere. That example of the cycle is now complete. And maybe that carbon gets absorbed again by a plant, or maybe it just sits there, and maybe it just builds up. So that is one path that a carbon atom can take through the carbon cycle. So understand how that works. And there are many different paths that a carbon atom can take through the cycle. That was just one example. Understand what carbon sinks are, also known as reservoirs. Understand kind of the relative length of time that an atom of carbon might spend in a sink. You know, would it spend more time as a fossil fuel? Would it spend more time in the leaf of a plant? Know those things. So take a look at this, watch the videos, and you can look up some outside resources. There are tons of great videos on YouTube about carbon sinks and reservoirs, and even some of the ways that humans are trying to develop technologies to artificially store carbon. They're coming up with all kinds of cool ideas to like pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pump it back underground where it's supposed to be, where it was before we dug it up and burned it out into the atmosphere. That, you know, you can extract CO2 from the atmosphere and pump it back underground, or you can use it. You can use it for other purposes. Maybe you can use it to create other compounds. But there's all kinds of technologies that we're trying to do to pull carbon out of the atmosphere through technology and sequester it somehow. Just get it out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere else. So that's something that's pretty cool that's happening right now too. But there's tons of videos you can look up about that. But otherwise, that's it for today. Thank you all for watching and have a great rest of your day.